Hello everyone, I'm BuffEnglish, and I'm here to buff up your English skills by giving you all the details you need to know about some of the world's greatest literature. Today we're discussing Act 3 in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. The third act in Shakespeare's plays is typically the climax, where all of the key game-changing events occur that determines the outcomes the characters will face in the later acts. In Romeo and Juliet, it's fair to say that it's Act 3 that officially turns the story from a possible romance into a definite tragedy. We enter this act back on the streets of Verona, with Benvolio begging Mercutio that they go inside, fearing that there will be some kind of a fight with the Capulets if they stick around. Interestingly, Mercutio scolds Benvolio, citing several prior instances of Benvolio starting just such a fight for practically no reason with random citizens, which is kind of surprising since Benvolio throughout the play seems like the peacemaking pacifist. But I love these glimpses we get of characters from Shakespeare, painting them as complex individuals instead of predictable, one-dimensional people. And, as fate would have it, moments later, Tybalt and friends enter the scene, seeking Romeo. If you remember from Act 2, Tybalt had noticed Romeo crashing the Capulet party and sent him a letter challenging him to a duel. Benvolio and Mercutio both know this, but have completely different reactions to Tybalt here. Benvolio, typically more practical, cautions that they take things indoors or coldly reason of your grievances. Mercutio, however, is in a completely different mood. We've seen Mercutio in previous scenes being a bit of a loose cannon, governed as much by his wit and his passions as anything else. And here we see these elements fully on display. Now, we have to wonder how serious Mercutio is as the scene goes along. On the one hand, we could interpret Mercutio's following interactions with Tybalt as dead serious, angry, and provoking. After all, he is no fan of Tybalt, and Tybalt is actively looking to duel with his friend Romeo. But then again, we could see a more lighthearted side of Mercutio. Still no fan of Tybalt, but able to rein in his passions and approach the situation with a sort of tense levity. But then, here comes Romeo himself, just in time to confuse everybody. A lot of the plot of Romeo and Juliet revolves around dramatic irony, where the audience knows things that some of the characters do not. The first major moment is right here. Romeo is literally coming from having just gotten married to Juliet, and we can imagine he's riding a bit of a high here. So when Tybalt tries to fight him, and Romeo replies, "I do protest I never injured thee, but love thee better than thou canst devise." Everyone is rather shocked. Did a Montague just say he loved a Capulet? I mean, Romeo has always been a little different, and this is just weird. I like looking at how different performances of the play render each character's different degree of surprise to Romeo's statements. So Romeo just refuses to fight, and Mercutio, still feeling surly, offers to fight Tybalt instead. In fact, he insults Romeo, calling his demeanor calm, dishonorable, vile submission. Mercutio and Tybalt do fight, and Romeo literally draws his sword and attempts to intervene to stop them, but something happens that leads to Tybalt stabbing Mercutio. Again, we have to consider here what exactly is going on. How serious are both of these combatants? Everyone knows very well that the penalty for brawling in the streets is execution, so are they earnestly engaging in a brawl? And did Tybalt mean to stab Mercutio? Did he mean to kill him? Or was it all just an accident? These are not questions answered directly by the script, and different directors might choose to stage these decisions differently. But once Mercutio is stabbed, thanks, according to him, to Romeo's intervention, the mood of the scene turns ghastly. Mercutio is literally bleeding out, and we see his dialogue vacillate between making dark puns, such as, "Ask for me tomorrow and you'll find me a grave man," to repeating his most famous line, "A plague on both your houses." He actually says this 3 times, and I wonder if each repetition of the curse on both families gets more serious as the truth of his imminent death becomes more apparent to him. Mercutio is, if you remember, a relative of the prince and not directly related to the Montagues or Capulets, and it's as though his death is a casualty of the larger feud the families have been engaging in. Romeo, in that moment, suddenly changes. He finds Tybalt and declares, "Away to heaven, respective lenity, and fire-eyed fury be my conduct now." Romeo makes an interesting parallel in some ways to Mercutio. While we're entertained and perplexed by Mercutio's wit and passion, we see that Romeo too shares some of these qualities, but in a far more dramatic, serious way. While Romeo, moments before, was feeling nothing but love towards the world, the death of his friend spurs the darker nature of his spirit into action. And just as he was elevated in one direction toward ineffable love, he plunges just as drastically in the other direction toward anger and vengeance. And now the fight is on. While we wondered how serious Mercutio and Tybalt's fight was, there's really no question here that Romeo and Tybalt are deadly serious. What's interesting is that Romeo wins the fight and kills Tybalt. Romeo, the soft lover boy, somehow defeats Tybalt, who was always itching for another fight. This seems unlikely, and many directors account for this by having it seem as though Romeo gets lucky rather than defeating Tybalt outright. But either way, once Tybalt falls, Benvolio tells Romeo to book it out of there, and he does. As he leaves, Romeo realizes that everything is about to fall apart, claiming, "I am fortune's fool." Even though just moments earlier he literally got secretly married to Juliet, he blames fate for the twist that has just arisen in his love story. The scene ends with the entire town coming out, including the prince, who is seeking order and justice. And Benvolio is there to report the whole thing. Now, we always have to pay attention when a character is about to report what we just saw happen. Will Benvolio's description to the prince of what happened be accurate or somewhat biased? After he speaks, Lady Capulet points out, "He is a kinsman to the Montague. Affection makes him false. He speaks not true." And it's true, Benvolio, nice guy though he is a biased source. He makes Romeo seem so loving and fair and peaceful, and depicts Tybalt as hot and violent. And remember how we wondered how seriously a director would want to depict Mercutio and Tybalt's fight, and how much Tybalt actually intended to kill Mercutio? Well, Benvolio outright says Tybalt stabbed Mercutio with an envious thrust, making Tybalt definitely seem like the murderous villain in this scenario. At any rate, the prince is fed up with everybody, and decrees that Romeo is banished from Verona. If he's found anywhere in the city, he'll be executed. This is the second time we have a situation where Romeo needs to run and hide or else be killed. The first was in the balcony scene in the Capulets' garden. But the tone of the drama has shifted dramatically. And now we know as an audience what no one else in the scene does. That not only is Romeo banished, but he just got secretly married and now killed his wife's cousin. And his whole relationship to Juliet is thrown into a chaotic mess. And that's just the first scene. Things, unfortunately, get a little worse for our star-crossed lovers. Next, we're ushered into Juliet's bedroom to find Juliet impatiently waiting for nighttime to come, since their plan was for Romeo to sneak into her bedroom at night to consummate their marriage. We have an infatuated, wistful, if not a little adolescent soliloquy of Juliet pining for her love to come. But then we have the nurse storm in, wailing about someone dying. Now, it takes the nurse about half of the scene to finally reveal to Juliet that Tybalt is dead and Romeo is banished. And although we're tempted to laugh at the nurse's ongoing inability to clearly articulate herself and Juliet's appropriate confusion, the news the nurse is bringing is so dark that there's no humor here. The scene contrasts Act 2, Scene 5, where it took the nurse the entire scene to tell Juliet the news she was bringing, in what was a comedic lead-up to a romantic encounter. But we see the grim parallel in this scene, where a completely different tone dominates the content, marking the dramatic shift in events the young couple is encountering. Once the nurse clarifies that Tybalt was killed by Romeo, Juliet shifts all of her sympathies to Romeo, even though she says that Tybalt was "my dearest cousin and dearer lord." She feels bad for Romeo, the guy she just met last night, remember? Since Romeo is banished, and now she will be unable to see him. She then calls Tybalt her villain cousin, and "Tybalt's dead that would have slain my husband." All this is comfort. The nurse can hardly believe Juliet, but Juliet is both glad that Tybalt and not Romeo died, but she's devastated that Romeo is now exiled from Verona. The way Juliet takes this news is shocking, but then again, when we think about the trajectory of Romeo and Juliet's relationship, maybe it's not so shocking that Juliet turns so quickly on her beloved cousin and clings that much more vehemently to her new lover. And the nurse, too, acts somewhat perplexedly, because even though she doesn't seem to think much of Romeo and is in fact lamenting Tybalt's death, she agrees to find Romeo and bring him secretly to Juliet. The nurse says that she knows where to find Romeo, and we know too. Friar Lawrence. It's interesting to note how little both Romeo and Juliet interact with their parents or family. The nurse seems like the best maternal figure Juliet has, whom Juliet confides in. Friar Lawrence similarly plays this role for Romeo, who feels like he can't trust his violent family and must conduct himself in secret. Romeo somewhat pitifully wails to the friar about being banished, and the friar finally needs to slap some sense into Romeo and remind him that A, Juliet is alive and well, B, he's still alive and wasn't killed by Tybalt, and C, he's only exiled, not executed. So just calm down, Romeo. But I also have to criticize the friar here too. Yes, he's talking sense into Romeo, but it seems like there are bigger problems Romeo is facing than just the immediate effects of this scene. I mean, his family is involved in a major deadly feud. He is married to the daughter of his father's mortal enemy, and there's absolutely no plan for how they're going to tell everybody about this marriage. I know Friar Lawrence needs to cheer Romeo up in the moment, but he's a little short-sighted here. But to make things worse, the second major game-changing moment occurs that night in the Capulet household. You see, Paris, that older man who wants to marry Juliet, is back talking to Juliet's parents, and something strange happens. Her father tells Paris that Juliet has been mourning the loss of her cousin and won't come out of her room to see him. And then, this same man who, the very day before, had told Paris that Juliet is too young and he should wait a few years to get married, this man, on a whim, tells Paris, "Oh, Thursday, tell her, she shall be married to this noble earl." Okay. So, just to recap, Romeo and Juliet met on Sunday, got married and banished on Monday, and now Juliet's father is ready to marry Juliet off to Paris on Thursday. As we noted in Act 1, the speed with which characters make major commitments to love, to death, to marriage is part of the origin of the story's problems. As planned, Romeo sneaks into Juliet's bedroom via the rope ladder he made, and the final scene of Act 3 begins with the two lovers enjoying their presence together. There's a natural tension in this scene between Romeo and Juliet wanting to enjoy one another's presence and love as much as possible, but they cannot do so in peace knowing that the events of the last day hover over their heads. Romeo must leave. By the way, Romeo's destination is the city of Mantua, which, according to Google Maps, is only about 28 miles or 46 kilometers away from Verona. Romeo finally descends the rope ladder and escapes the Capulet compound. This, by the way, is the last time Romeo and Juliet are on stage alive together, though nobody knows this at the time. What the audience does know at this time, and what Juliet is about to find out, is that her father is making her get married on Thursday to Paris. Juliet's mother has the unfortunate privilege of breaking this news to her, but their conversation starts by addressing Tybalt's death, and Juliet has a very veiled and somewhat comical way of speaking about Romeo to her mother. When her mother comments that Romeo, that traitorous villain, still lives, Juliet replies, "Aye, madam, from the reach of these my hands would none but I might venge my cousin's death." And later, "Oh, how my heart abhors to hear him named and cannot come to him, to wreak the love I bore my cousin upon his body that hath slaughtered him." So then, the shoe drops. Lady Capulet tells Juliet that she has some great news. Juliet is going to marry Paris. The mother here justifies this as an attempt to pull thee from thy heaviness of all this alleged grieving over Tybalt. But Juliet is having none of it. She flat out says, no, that's not going to happen. Then her dad shows up and he flies into a rage. What's interesting is that up until this point, Capulet has seemed a somewhat chill, go-with-the-flow kind of guy, but not here. He tells Juliet, "Get thee to church o' Thursday, or never after look me in the face." And when he's truly seething, "Hang, beg, starve, die in the streets, for by my soul I ne'er acknowledged thee, nor what is mine shall ever do thee good." Everyone tries telling him he is a little too worked up, but his word is final, and the climactic act ends with Juliet now being forced to marry Paris or get kicked out of her family. When Juliet looks to the nurse for advice, the nurse tells her to marry Paris and move on from Romeo. Juliet outwardly agrees, but when she's left alone, she concludes the act in a soliloquy, revealing to us that she's going to ignore everything her family just said and try to find her own way out of this mess. So, what do you think about Romeo and Juliet's decision-making up to this point? Should teenagers listen to their parents when it comes to matters of love? Should teens keep secrets from their parents, for that matter? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And now that we're over the hurdle of the climax, there's nothing left to do except see all the fallout and pitiful attempts our characters make to turn love, haste, secrets, hate, and murder into a happy ending.